style begin in the Six Dynasties period, also known as the Age of Disunion, during which numerous Han-controlled families ruled parts of China. This time period marks the gradual, very consequential shift in civilization from the ancient center of northeast China to southern China, where new capitals were established and the regions were largely separated from invasions and attacks from northwestern Asia. The Nymph of the Luo River is a hand scroll painted by the master of the Six Dynasties period, Kaizhi. He was arguably the most important artist of the Six Dynasties period. This is an example of his combined figure painting with elements of landscape, but for the most part, figure painting is what flourished in the Six Dynasties. Landscape painting will become much more important later, especially in the Song Dynasty. This is a detail from the Admonitions of the Instructress to the ladies of the palace, another masterwork by Kaizhi, and various scenes we will study. This particular series of scenes was painted onto a traditional hand scroll and narrated the courtly life of women during this time. Figure painting flourished in Six Dynasties court, particularly with graceful, smoothly, finely drawn figures, such as those seen here in this copy from the Tang Dynasty. The original has not survived. Because of the continued importance of Confucius and the teachings of Confucius during this time, figure paintings often narrated or often represented Confucian moral themes, such as the preferred behavior of a wife to her husband, or the conduct of children with regard to their elders. The Six Canons on Painting by Xie He was written during this time. It would prove to be influential throughout the centuries of Chinese development in painting. The first and foremost canon was the Qi Yun, the spirit or breath of life in the painting. Integral to the first canon is the second canon, the method for using the brush. The brushwork in writing and calligraphy was considered the highest art, as a means of transmitting culture, a means of transmitting knowledge, and as a way of expressing the Qi Yun. Because Chinese script is almost wholly abstract, it was judged based on the quality of the brushwork, and the paintings of the figures were judged in the same way. Note, however, that the brushwork for this script was much more varied in line weight and varied in texture and rhythm and direction. Meanwhile, the figures were very smooth, fluid, finely drawn. The third canon was truthfulness to the object and regard for naturalism. To review vocabulary that we've previously studied, naturalism is a method of representation in painting or sculpture based on close observation of the natural world with the careful attempt to adhere to the appearance of nature. The use of naturalism in art almost always overlaps with the use of stylization. Here, in the scene of Lady Feng and the bear, the Chinese native style is quickly recognized, but at the same time, there is sensitivity to naturalistic representation. In this case, the figures and especially the bear. The fourth canon was conformity in kind to colors, which generally applied to color in the decorative sense with some regard for naturalism, but with freedom as well. The fifth canon was planning in the placement of elements, which is also overlapping with the first canon of Qi Yun. The figures and objects in the picture plane were situated with great care, but without the aim of representing a logical space or a recognizable background. This is unlike Western European painting, which often emphasized space and composition. In Chinese painting, the emphasis was on the brushwork. The sixth canon was the transmission of experience of the past, and this corresponds with Chinese social, ancestral, and spiritual connections with the past. Copying the work of great masters from the past was a way of study, a way of retracing the master's inspired hand and arm movements. Very few hand scrolls survive from the Six Dynasties period. It's actually very fortunate indeed that copies were made. How else could we study and appreciate the work of Gu Kaizhi? In this copy, we are looking at the scene of the mountain and hunter. This is one of the earliest examples of landscape painting. The emphasis, however, is not really on the landscape, but on morality. An isolated mountain was used symbolically and to communicate the teachings of Confucius. The inscription reinforces that. There are two vertical bands of Chinese inscription that loosely translate into English as, "He who aims too high shall be brought low." Courtly paintings such as these were didactic. That is, they were overtly instructive, and in this case, instructive of the Analects of Confucius, and communicated the importance of humility, modesty, sincerity, and common sense. The Admonitions introduced this first scene. It shows a man and a woman facing each other, indicating a basic theme in this and other paintings. That is, the role of women in feudal society and the proper relationship between a man and a woman. These scenes are examples that visually evidence the tendencies in court painting of the Six Dynasties period. There is an emphasis on the human figures. Only the essential forms are used to tell the story. There is great austerity and simplicity in the painting that reflects Confucian principles, as well as the proper conduct, which is channeled through the paintings and presented here with sincerity and simplicity rather than flashy extravagance. In the Admonitions series by Gu Kaizhi, the Lady Feng and the bear scene narrate a legendary tale in the life of Lady Feng. She was a consort to the Han Emperor, and she placed herself in the path of a bear in attempt to protect the emperor and to save his life. Here again, we see Confucian themes and morals. And whether we agree with these beliefs or not, among the Analects of Confucius were the expectations of wives to respect their husbands and women to respect the patriarchy. Only the essential forms and figures are used to tell the story. There's great austerity and simplicity, and again, the proper conduct channeled through the paintings is presented with sincerity rather than flashy flamboyance. There are various copies of this masterpiece by Gu Kaizhi. This is an extraordinary work that remained focused on the essential forms and human figures, but did incorporate landscape and water and mountains, providing background but also necessary context. Here we see the emerging representations of landscape painting that will reach maturity by the Song Dynasty. Remember, these scrolls are read and viewed from right to left, and the narrative continues in the third part as the scroll is read, and at the end of the scroll, the painting concludes to feature Chinese inscriptions and many red stamp seals from the artist, the collectors, and the different owners of the scroll throughout the centuries. During the early half of the Tang Dynasty, the 7th and early 8th centuries, there was a relative period of peace and stability. The international import-export economy, supported by the Silk Road, stretched from southern China all the way to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. There were extraordinary achievements in human civilization, advancements in science and technology. This was one of the wealthiest periods of all the history of China. That is accompanied by a flourishing of arts and culture, and the arts reflect that wealth in many ways. Note that the decline of the Tang Dynasty does begin in the mid to late 8th century. The 87 Immortals by the Tang Dynasty master Wu Daozi provides an example of the extraordinary brushwork and line used to represent forms and human figures in the painting. The 87 Immortals by Wu Daozi features an unprecedented variety of line weights. There are faint, thin lines, thin to medium line weights, medium to heavy line weights, with the occasional solid black. There is a very continuous, fluid movement of line and power of brushwork, while honoring the principles of Chinese painting, including the Qiyun. There is a great extent of detail, expression, and animation. This is the Bodhisattva from the painted banner from the mid-8th century Nara period of Japan. This is corresponding with the Tang Dynasty in China. And the style of line and brushwork from the Tang Dynasty was adopted by Buddhist artists in Japan. And here again we see this smooth, fluid, expressive line. The style of line established with Wu Daozi and his contemporaries was seen as far west as the Mugoa Caves at Dunhuang. The frontispiece featuring the Diamond Sutra was an example of this. This is an ink painting on paper. It dates between the 8th and 9th centuries CE. The narrative represented here includes the elder Subhuti, who is represented in the lower left corner, kneeling down, looking towards the Buddha, who is centrally placed, and asking the Buddha, what should we do or think in order to attain enlightenment? The Buddha answers, those who are seeking enlightenment should not be deceived by the world of appearances. How do the visual qualities of the painting relate to Subhuti's question and his spiritual journey? The Diamond Sutra lacks contrasts. Specifically, it lacks contrast of light and dark. It lacks contrast of thick and thin lines. It lacks recognizable positive and negative space. The line weight is very uniform. And this causes the image to lack a foreground and a background space. It is quite difficult to see the figure of Subhuti. In fact, it's difficult to see the space at all. It's almost like a confusing optical illusion. The Diamond Sutra transports us back to ancient India, to the Buddha's teachings, that life was an endless cycle of pleasure, pain, death, and rebirth, an endless cycle of reincarnation. The world was illusory. That is, human beings could easily be deceived or tempted by the world of appearances, the world of physical beauty, material wealth, high social status, and so on. These are illusions because they create a temporary sense of being, but disappear at the moment of death. Only by attaining enlightenment is it possible to escape the endless cycle of reincarnation. Lacking in contrasts, the Diamond Sutra is wavering and tenuous. It's very unsteady, it's very precarious, as if we ourselves as viewers could be deceived just as easily as the elder Subhuti. Here are two examples of Buddhist architecture in Nara, Japan that are contemporary with Tang Dynasty Buddhist architecture. Why do we have to go to Japan to study the Six Dynasties and Tang Buddhist architecture? We have to go to Japan because the Six Dynasties and Tang Buddhist architecture in China did not survive. During the imperial proscription in the mid-9th century, almost 5,000 Buddhist temples in China were destroyed. Only one single temple in China survived this period, and that is the Shanxi on Mount Wutai. This is in the Shanxi province dating to the late 8th century. The probable reason for its survival was because of its location. It was in a very, very remote, high altitude in the mountain. This is an exquisite example of Tang Buddhist architecture in China. It is small, especially compared to the Tosho Daiji, the Tang-style temple in Japan. It is weighty, it's horizontal in appearance, it expands into space by means of a platform and porch, it is organized, and it bears similarities to Buddhist monuments. This is a photograph of Mount Wutai. This is a sacred site in China's northeast province of Shanxi, surrounded by a cluster of mountain peaks. The mountain is home to many of China's most important monasteries and temples. This image also gives us some pause to appreciate the magnificent landscape of China. And we can almost imagine ourselves as painters looking at this beautiful, magnificent, lush landscape and attempting to record our perception of this landscape onto a silk scroll. This scroll is the Wangchuan Villa. It is a major work, actually, by Wang, a master Tang artist. It was created during the earlier part, the more stable part of the Tang Dynasty, the 8th century. This is before the decline of the Tang Dynasty. And it was the first painting in which the landscape truly became the primary subject matter, rather than only background. The Wangchuan Villa incorporates a scene on a hilly estate. There are various buildings. There are peasants working, as well as fishermen in a few boats. And instead of pure narrative or emphasis on figures, there is topography. It is as if a surveyor made a pictorial map of the estate and all of the rich topography. The Wangchuan Villa could be considered an archaic space in that it lacks the confidence that we see later in the Song painters. For example, the space behind where the mountains are seems to tilt forward towards the viewer. Interestingly, medieval European painters struggled with the exact same problem for centuries. There is some difficulty in creating a convincing space as forms in the landscape recede into the distance, although Wei partially addresses this by including a river in the foreground. The scenes are full of life, full of color, narrative, texture, and detail. It is really a model of early Tang Dynasty richness and splendor. Remember, the earlier half of the Tang Dynasty was the wealthiest period in Chinese history. This painting was very influential to many generations of Song Dynasty painters. Beginning in the Five Dynasties period, Chinese scroll painting developments evolved into distinct styles, which in Sherman Lee's History of Far Eastern Art are referred to as modes. One was the monumental mode, exemplified here in this Five Dynasties period landscape. Scenes along the Zhao and Xiang River, we see early developments of the monumental mode. There is a deep space, there is an atmospheric quality that helps expand the depth and give it this incredibly vast space. But the problem of space has not been fully resolved. It is divided into self-contained and somewhat awkward parts. The atmospheric planes of the space are inconsistent, and the foreground, midground, and background seem to follow three different planes. In the Song Dynasty, we reach a level of artistic achievement not just in painting, but also in ceramics. Many schools and centers of learning were established during this time. Much of the Song periods were peaceful and stable in terms of the economy, and the developing economic situation, in fact, allowed for the emergence in China of a mercantile class and a wealthy bourgeois class who could afford to pay artists and who could purchase hand-painted scrolls and handmade beautiful porcelain ceramic wares. The Song Dynasty was divided into Northern Song and the Southern Song. The founding and early Song emperors wished to depart from the feudal wars and military dictators and hereditary rulers, which they felt were to blame for the destruction of the great and glorious Tang Dynasty. The founding and early Song emperors actually turned to Confucianism, wished to emphasize Confucianism, specifically the ancient original teachings of Confucius, rather than interpretations offered by the Han and the Six Dynasty courts. The revival of original principles of Confucius is known as Neo-Confucianism or New Confucianism, and it dominates southern China. Buddhism was still practiced, but primarily in northern and northwestern China. We can further study the monumental mode with this painting, Streams and Mountains Without End, from the Northern Song. Painting during the Song Dynasty was deliberately more restrained. In the monumental mode, built upon the practices of Neo-Confucianism, paintings of mountains and rivers became metaphors for morality. The qi yin in the painting continued to be important, but there was also appreciation for the transmission of the artist's own character and feelings. In Streams and Mountains Without End, the landscape transforms until it reaches a climactic scene of great height, providing an excellent example of the monumental mode. In the monumental mode, mountains dominate certain areas within the picture plane, and smaller, low-lying, and intimate landscape occupy other areas. Transitions to large mountainous spaces become dramatic and very intense, and transitions to lower rolling hills within the landscape are subdued. Often certain areas dissolve like a mist into the distance. The hanging scroll was a format that lent well to the monumental mode because it helped to capture the majestic height of the mountains. The hanging scroll was displayed vertically. But the Chinese hand scroll was also used for the monumental mode. The organization of time that is implicit in the hand scroll allowed for transitions in the image, which move from right to left. Another classification or mode identified and described by Sherman Lee in the History of Far Eastern Art is the courtly mode. An example of the courtly mode is observed in this painting by Zhao Buju. This is River and Mountains in Autumn Color. Here is the entire scroll opened. Here is a more enlarged detail of the scroll. The monumental mode often allowed for large passages of empty space within the picture plane. This is in contrast to the space of the courtly mode. That is exemplified here in River and Mountains in Autumn Color. The space in the courtly mode was crowded. It was filled with mountains and trees and buildings and bodies of water. The Chinese courtly mode featured lush, aristocratic landscapes, more like gardens rather than rugged wilderness. The colors used were bright pastel greens, pastel blues, and whites. The compositions were uplifting, richly varied, and complex. This is a work of calligraphy by Mi Fu, a Chinese poet and painter who lived during the Northern Song period. It is important to remember that calligraphy, the highest and most historically important art form of China, was something to which Chinese artists dedicated their careers and their lives. The qi yun, the breath of life, the spirit, guided ways in which Chinese artists for centuries have used calligraphy to express their energy, their intellect, their emotions, and their creativity. Here again is the River and Mountains in Autumn Color by Zhao Buju. This is a detail of the end of the hand scroll, which features Chinese inscriptions in black ink and brush calligraphy, and to each side there are small red stamp seals from the artist, from collectors, and from subsequent generations of individuals who have cared for and appreciated this beautiful scroll. This photograph is one of 5 stills from a demonstration on the ritual of reading, viewing, and appreciating a traditional Chinese scroll. The demonstration is provided by Dr. Maxwell Hearn, Director of Asian Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This photograph shows the scroll removed from its silk wrapping while the brocaded silk woven ribbon is about to be untied to open the scroll. The red stamp seals are each unique. One is usually from the artist. Others are usually from the various collectors, owners, and subsequent generations in China who have read and studied this scroll. As the scroll opens, the painting starts to emerge. When studying Chinese painted hand scrolls, whether from the Six Dynasties, the Tang, the Five Dynasties Period, the Northern Song, the Southern Song, continuing certainly to the Yuan and the Ming, one element that all of these Chinese hand scrolls have in common is the intimate nature in which they are handled, in which they are treated with great care and amended to add new seals and new inscriptions. The way in which they are visually appreciated as worlds in and of themselves, meaning that the viewer is transported in mind and spirit, and the viewer enters the world of the painting. These scrolls were meant to be viewed closely, intimately, usually one viewer at a time, and read from right to left. Near the end of the scroll, the painting concludes and we see various inscriptions, including the title of the artwork written by the artist, some descriptions about the artwork, and about the history of the scroll. These inscriptions are written by owners as it passes through different generations over many centuries. Students who wish to view this demonstration in a video format, as well as other videos on Chinese painting by Maxwell Hearn, can navigate to the official website for Asian art and the Asian art collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City.